Welcome to Energy Solutions, a podcast from the Electric Power Supply Association. I'm your host, Todd Snitchler, EPSA's president and CEO. This episode features a former chairman and commissioner at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, who was also an executive vice president at NextEra Energy. While at FERC, he created the Office of Enforcement to guard against market manipulation and the Office of Reliability to, as the name might suggest, help ensure reliable electricity. Two significant initiatives, to say the least. We presented EPSA's first ever Competitive Power Champion Award to him at our recent Competitive Power Summit. While he was unable to join us in person there, he was kind enough to sit down with me today and talk us through his prolific career, share his expert views on power markets and other top energy issues, and give us a behind-the-scenes look into what it was like inside FERC. Let's hear from Joe Kelliher. Well, Joe, thanks so much for joining us today on Energy Solutions. We certainly appreciated the comments that you were kind enough to offer when you accepted our Competitive Edge Award in March, and hope that you had a great trip. But your comments were very warmly received by many of our attendees, many of whom you've worked with or probably still are working with for years now. So I'm glad we had this chance to talk to you more about the work you've done to promote competitive markets and some of the issues that we're facing today. So welcome, and we're glad to have you.
Thanks very much. I've heard good things about the podcast, so I'm grateful to join some of the illustrious predecessors.
Excellent. Well, first, before we get started, for those that may not be as familiar as we are with your background, can you kind of give us a little bit of a snapshot about your background and how you got started in energy?
Sure. It wasn't my original focus. My original focus at age 18, I had a very clear career focus. I wanted to be an international political risk analyst.
Wow.
And I would study. I don't know why at the age 18 I knew this profession existed, but I would make an assessment on the stability of this country or that country. Someone else would bother with economics, and then someone else would make decisions.
Sure.
And I still don't know why I had that focus, but that's why I went to Georgetown School of Foreign Service, because that's their focus. But when I was there, I started getting interested in politics and had some internships on the Hill. And at one point, I actually thought it would be a real honor to be in Congress. And now I think it would be more of a curse than an honor. So it's on the other end of the spectrum.
Fair enough.
But my first job ahead of college was at a law firm that had an energy practice. I was thinking of going to law school, and I was a paralegal that had a focus on energy legislation. At that point, Congress was looking at natural gas decontrol. Mm-hmm. So I would go to the markups in the House Energy and Commerce Committee and the Senate Energy Committee. Also, there were a lot of Bonneville hearings, so I'd go to those hearings and I'd write summaries. And it was at that point, Congress was still really efficient about legislating. Mm-hmm. And I remember one markup where there was a decontrol bill in the House Energy Committee, and Dingell lost. It was on the Broyhill-Richardson amendment, and Chairman Dingell lost the test vote. And in his inimical style, he picks up this enormous gavel and he says, "Gentlemen, you may have the votes, but I have the gavel. Markup adjourned, subject to call the chair." So anyway, that my first job was in energy, which I thought I was not predestined for, but my father is an oil tanker broker. Okay. So I guess growing up, I thought energy is a respectable profession, sure, respectable field. And then once I had that first job, then I ended up working on the Hill, doing energy work, was an energy lobbyist, if you will, for a utility, for a nuclear trade association, went to law school at night, and then ended up on a council on the House Energy and Commerce Committee. So I've really, since that first job, I've been in the energy field in different capacities, usually on the regulated side of energy, not the oil and gas side.
Sure. And at any point during that process, did you think to yourself, FERC would be a pretty attractive spot for me, given my background? Or like many of us who have stumbled into the regulatory field, was it kind of the by accident, how did I end up here? But now that I'm here, let's do good work kind of situation?
Doesn't every boy and girl dream of being a FERC chairman or commissioner? No.
That may be a small group of boys and girls.
No, my first exposure to FERC was right after I started that job with the law firm. That law firm is now K&L Gates. Oh, yeah. And they still have a significant energy practice, but they had a different name at the time. But my first exposure to FERC was the public document room on 825 North Capitol, where I had to get a copy of the Merwin Dam decision. And I didn't know where Merwin Dam was. But
Sure.
at that point, the public document room was sort of like the soup Nazi episode from
Yeah.
Seinfeld. You had to be really polite and deferential when you requested your order, or you were
Yep.
never going to get it.
That's
So
right.
I was very obsequious and asked for the Merwin Dam decision. So my first exposure to FERC was the document room. And then a few years later, I was working for Public Service Electric and Gas, and Energy Policy Act of 92 was going through.
Sure.
So I was on a working group on the 92 Act. And so you're exposed to FERC. And I always thought it was much more so than other agencies, like, for example, EPA. FERC was much more inclined to make a merits-based decision
Right.
than an end result-oriented decision, a politically dictated decision. So I always respected that. And then later on, when I was with a counsel for the Energy and Commerce Committee, when the Republicans took the majority, I would organize FERC oversight hearings. And again, just continue to be impressed with the quality of the commissioners and the staff. Worked a lot with Cindy Marlette on some energy legislation that drafted the first comprehensive electricity bill in March of 98. And I trusted Cindy, I trusted the FERC staff, so I would share drafts of it and ask for their comments. And they had some really good suggestions on what not to include. And it was, when I was a committee counsel, then the possibility came to mind. But it's much easier. I was on the House side, and of course, usually, if someone from Congress goes to FERC, it's almost always someone from the Senate side.
That's right.
Yeah. So then I went to the transition team, Bush Cheney transition team, and then worked for Abraham. So then I was in a better position because House staff, it's really hard for House staff to get these jobs. But again, I thought I would be a temporary employee just during the transition, but the secretary asked me to go because the California crisis was still, raging, and the secretary didn't have a personal background on these issues, and we had developed a nice rapport during the transition. So at some point in the administration, I started to think it was a possibility.
Okay. So you noted in your acceptance comments on the award that you'd previously received an award from a consumer group, and you thought it was interesting that you now have received an award from a consumers group, but also from a competitive organization. And you said in your comments that some might find that to be an odd juxtaposition. Can you expound on that a little bit? And why would some people think that those are not congruous awards, or why would they be in conflict?
I think they're in perfect harmony, but it's more of an expression of frustration that some people seem to think if you're pro-consumer, then you're anti-competition, and the reverse. Sometimes there have been FERC commissioners who will call themselves a consumer commissioner, but then they usually are talking about retail consumers. Right. So I'm trapped in a linear mind. So I'm like, those are not our consumers. Those are not FERC consumers. That's someone else's responsibility.
Yep.
And I also think imposing the lowest possible electric rate is different than a just and reasonable rate. A just and reasonable rate is a rate that encourages continued investment.
That's right.
And the lowest possible electric rate, if that's your inclination, the next question you have to ask is what's your minimum level of reliability that you want to achieve?
Right.
Because you're not going to have the same reliability as if you have a rate that encourages continued investment. And it just frustrates me that that's not apparent, it's not intuitive.
Yeah, and I would look at that and say, our utility cousins aren't paid the lowest possible rate. They get a just and reasonable rate to ensure that they continue to invest. So it's very simpatico on what markets were intended to do and what regulatory structures are supposed to replicate the power of markets. That feels very much in line with how it's supposed to work. So I share your consternation at why that wouldn't be a consistent philosophy. It feels very, very, very consistent from our perspective.
Right. I think it's expressed in the Federal Power Act and how what is just and reasonable rate. It's the balancing of those two things. So
that's exactly right.
A rate that's reasonably low but encourages continued investment.
Yeah. Well, you've opened up a laundry list of questions that I've got around those issues for you. So I'm sure that you may regret that comment, but we'll have a good discussion regardless. But you were part of the early push to implement competition and put market forces in the wholesale markets that were able to work, and also to create the rules to ensure that they would work in a way that they were designed to work and that people couldn't take advantage of the system, et cetera. What were some of the critical issues that you faced? Obviously, the California energy crisis was still very apparent, as you noted, but aside from that, or including that, and what other items were on your mind as you were coming into your role at FERC?
Well, first of all, I wouldn't say I'm a founding father of competition policy. I'd leave that to Betsy and her generation. But I certainly believe that the policy was the correct policy. And so I guess I continued their push, but I was not
Okay, fair
part of
enough.
yeah. And then, but my arriving at FERC, the first challenge to me was as a commissioner, we were still in the wake of the California Western power
Hmm.
crisis. And I thought it was really important to help people understand that the California Western power crisis was not a failure of competition. It was a failure of regulation,
Right.
regulation by the state of California. And that, that was like part of my mantra for years after I got at FERC. I probably was still saying it in my last meeting. And I think it's correct, first of all.
Hmm.
And I think there seemed to be a recognition of that. But I was worried about if there would be a backlash, because Congress at that point was working on energy legislation.
Right.
And really I mean, President Bush had his national energy strategy on March 16th of 2001, I think.
Hmm.
Then, and then they sent kind of legislative specs up later on, at least on electricity. So really, since 2001 on, electricity and broader energy legislation was being built in Congress. And it would be a simple matter to outlaw competition
Hmm.
in the federal power act. It
Right.
would be a sentence frag. And I was really surprised and impressed that no one in Congress tried. No one, it didn't happen. There was no
Right.
serious effort. I'm not aware there was any effort to affix responsibility for California Western power crisis on the law, on the act. Now, there were certainly attempts this drove me crazy, to criticize FERC for not exercising its non-existent anti-manipulation authority and
Yeah.
its non-existent penalty authority, which in part inspired me to write a law review article, spelling out
Hmm.
why FERC needed those authorities and what were some models to accomplish that. And that law review article, I understand, influenced Senator Bingaman, who was then chairman of the Senate Energy Committee, to actually support those kinds of ideas.
Hmm.
But that was kind of the main push, is just to defend FERC from these unfair attacks.
Sure.
I was poised to help defend against attempts to amend the act to outlaw competition, but those attempts never arose.
Right.
And really just explaining the real cause of the California Western power crisis. But that was helpful. And then proposing solutions to make sure,
Hmm.
not just saying, hey, it wasn't our fault,
Correct.
to say it wasn't our fault, but if we had these additional authorities, we could prevent a recurrence or at least make someone really feel pain if they were to try to manipulate markets.
Yeah.
And I'll take some credit. I did that first electricity bill I wrote in March of '98. That had civil penalty authority in it, because it seemed that if FERC historically had relied on cost-based rates to prevent market
Hmm.
power exercise, but then they were shifting to reliance on market rules, RTO market rules, you needed to have penalty authority
That's
so that
right.
there's consequence. It has to be more than disgorgement of
Right.
your ill-gotten gains. That's not a huge disincentive.
Right.
It had to be penalty authority. And the $1 million, frankly, that was in my March of '98 bill. And that's because I thought, as a Republican, I was annoyed at persistent attempts to describe Republicans as in the pocket for
Right.
corporate America. So I thought the penalty should be big, and $1 million sounded big. And it's actually, I've always been amused that no one ever asked where $1 million came from, but it was not very scientific.
Well, it certainly seems like you were prescient in what you were working on, because it foretold some of the things that were missing. And I'm delighted to hear you remind people that the California energy crisis isn't a failure of markets, because I fear that that has gone down the memory hole in a lot of cases, because I often hear critics of markets say, well, that was the whole part of this. This whole thing came from this California mess. And I think it's a convenient foil, but it's factually incorrect. And
Right, right. Yep.
your your intensity in replying to that, I think, is sometimes overlooked, because people like to go to their favorite whipping boy, and that's the straw man of anti-market rhetoric.
Right, right.
So why did you think it was important to balance or to correctly implement competitive markets? As you said, you inherited some of the framework, but clearly we had some bad experience that was not directly related to it, but certainly cast a pall on some of the states. And in fact, there were probably half a dozen states that had started to move into the competitive posture, and then as a result of California backed away. Some
Mhm.
continued to go through the process. Were those some of the things you were thinking about as you were trying to think about the best way to implement competitive policies, or were those not the issues and you had a
Yeah.
separate set of things you were thinking about?
I thought it was a mistake to impose the RTO structure on regions that hadn't volunteered for that structure.
Right.
And I thought that there was some thinking at FERC that, well, it was the absence of that structure through the entire West, which helped cause or contribute to the California Western power
Mhm.
crisis. But I just thought politically there was no chance that that actually would be recognized.
That also
Uh,
turned out to be very prescient.
well, yeah, and so it just seemed that it was I mean, SMD united the entire spectrum of Congress. You
Yeah.
had letters. I mean, someone who worked on the Hill, normally to get more and more people to sign a letter, you water it down to the point where
Right.
it says virtually nothing. But you would have really strongly worded, very clear, angry letters that Trent Lott and Maria Cantwell would sign,
Yeah.
right? And so that was a clear sign that SMD ultimately was, even if FERC had the legal authority, and I actually think it did, if it had the legal authority, it wasn't necessarily going to be very permanent,
Right.
uh, even if the votes were there.
Sure.
And in part because I had a historically long nomination process, so I would watch multi-member commissions routinely. I'd watch the SEC, the FCC, and FERC. And the FCC and SEC at that time were both pursuing initiatives where they were very aggressive initiatives. But I thought, in my inexpert judgment in those laws, the chairman had legal authority to act.
Right.
He had a plausible, record or policy rationale. He had the votes, but in both cases, those chairmen were stymied. And I think that the same was true ultimately with FERC and SMD.
Right.
So it's sort of a lesson that you don't need Congress's approval before you do major reforms. But if they strongly oppose, the agency can die a death of 1,000 cuts. Just the distractions that result can drain you of any energy to any ability to move the ball forward.
Yep. And that makes a lot of sense. So you mentioned the Office of Enforcement and the Office of Electric Reliability, which of course established mandatory standards, and you also were instrumental in implementing the Energy Policy Act of 2005. So your legislative and implementation career seems to come full circle on some of these things. As you look back, what were some of the most important things that you think came out of the Energy Policy Act of 2005 and how you worked to try to implement that to make it functional at FERC? I mean, because that was the first time in 25 years, probably, or close to it, that we had energy policy changes. And I'll come back to this question in a minute because it's been almost 25 years again, and it makes me wonder if we're due for another revisitation. But I'll let you answer the first question
Sure.
first before I get you with the next one.
I was very happy with the anti-manipulation order. I was really happy that both the substance of it, but also the speed. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, the law was enacted on August 9th of 2005, and we issued a final rule in January. And
That's light speed at FERC.
yeah, that's very fast. And
Yeah.
it was an instant final rule. It was immediately effective because we were still dealing with the after effects of Hurricanes Katrina and Rita. But it's hard to choose the other rules because
Mm-hmm.
I love all of my rules. That, like, when I during my chairmanship, we issued 58 final rules,
Wow.
which is more than the agency had issued in the prior 15 years. Uh, and I think they're all sort of like my children.
Mm-hmm.
And one was overturned by the Fifth Circuit, and I can't say I disagreed with them. That was on a market transparency rule,
Okay.
where the term in the act was market participant, an undefined term, and we were requiring intrastate pipelines to report gas volumes, and
Sure.
that would certainly help market transparency. But the Fifth Circuit said, sure, market participants undefined, but you don't have jurisdiction over intrastate. So
Yep.
I can't say they got it wrong. But of those rules, 58 is a big number, and I was
It
so
is.
curious. I looked up. I remember once knowing that Zeus had many children, and if I view these rules as my children, Zeus had 92 children. 41 were godlike, and I ended up with 58 children. One was killed in the crib, I guess, by a
Right.
snake. Yeah, he didn't. That rule didn't have Hercules,
Right.
hand power, arm power. Anyway, so I really like all of them. The thing I liked most was how efficient we were.
Yeah.
And
I
that's a
mean, that's
product.
remarkable, really. The amount of
Well,
work to get 58 rules together is remarkable.
yeah, and to have one
Yeah.
be, and many of the others were important rules that I expected judicial review, but we did, I think, a very good job thanks to John Moot and my my other the other principal staff.
Sure.
We had really effective outreach to groups that normally would reflexively challenge a FERC rule, and so they knew that their view mattered, and it
Yeah.
shaped the product. But the thing I guess I'm proudest of is that we didn't have false starts. We didn't have trial balloons.
Yep.
I think literally everything we started, we finished, right? So, and that's efficient. That's
That's
so
also a
that
credit to your leadership because that doesn't just happen. I mean, that comes from the top.
Well, chairmen either get too much credit or too much blame for what the commission does or doesn't do. Uh, the chairman's the only one with the gavel, but he or she only has one vote. I was lucky to work with a highly talented group of commissioners with strong personalities and even stronger opinions. And, I had the good sense to listen to them and take their advice. And that's the real secret of how we were able to go and do so much so fast. And they were great colleagues.
to me, what's a good colleague in a multi-member dynamic? It's really someone who lays down their cards and tells you
Mhm.
where they stand.
That's right.
That's not always been true at FERC and other agencies. Sometimes people hold off, they watch where everyone comes out, and then they dissent.
Hmm.
Um, And even though, like, and to me, I thought, look, if you're dissenting and you've never tried to incorporate the change
Right.
that you're dissenting on, that's showing a political rationale. You've chosen you want to stand apart from the commission,
Right.
and then you'll figure out a reason later on. And that, I can understand the political rationale there, but I went to FERC to shape policy, and I always considered a dissent a personal failure.
Mm.
It meant that, of course, I have a different opinion than the rest of the commission.
Sure.
Of course, I'm right and they're wrong. And I had a failure to persuade. So I was always sad writing a dissent, whereas, some people really like writing dissents. I was always sort of sad about it. It felt like I hadn't done my job properly.
Yeah, I also like to try to minimize the split votes when we could, because it certainly suggests that you probably landed in a more durable and better spot than staking out an extreme position and then having people inside the agency criticize you.
I
That feels
agree,
like
but
on the
yeah,
other side, it's a similar, like, what did I fail to do in order to
uh-huh.
make sure we could get to the right answer?
But I wasn't afraid of dissents. I always, one of my
Sure.
ads, I'd always prefer to have a crisp and correct 4-1 or 3-2
Yep.
than a mushy 5-0.
Yeah.
And
It needs to say something, right?
it
I mean,
does.
to your
Yeah,
point earlier, you can water it down so it doesn't really do anything, and that fails the test of
right.
what we're doing here.
Well, at the same time, across the railroad tracks from FERC is the SEC, and the SEC chairman at the time, his approach was never to bring anything for a vote until every single commissioner
Oh,
approved it. And I thought, wow, you're ceding a tremendous amount of
yeah.
power to all of your colleagues.
Yeah.
Um, because I thought it was just a healthier dynamic for if a commissioner knew you're desperate for their vote, then they will extract a very high price. Whereas if you thought you would prefer their vote, then they're reasonable changes you'll make, and the other
Mhm.
unreasonable ones you'll just
Right.
you'll
We'll just
decline.
agree to disagree.
And
Exactly.
that's a healthier dynamic, and that's why there's five, right? If we're supposed to be a unimind, we'd just be a single administrator agency.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yep. So there's all kinds of issues today that they feel like history doesn't repeat, but it echoes. And so there are a number of things today where we're hearing, can wholesale power markets meet the changing dynamic? Are they elastic enough and durable enough to meet a changing energy mix and model? And you worked through some pretty contentious times and came out, I mean, based on your description, what we were just talking about, with some significant amounts of work that came out that really helped build on what your predecessors had done. So in your opinion, can markets survive, or more importantly, can they meet the energy demands that we're facing? And do they need an update? Like, are we working on we're using a model 2005 car when we really should be working on a 2030 car?
I think markets can survive. I have doubts whether the current structure is working. I mean, I think the RTOs with forward capacity markets, I don't think the prices that their rules are delivering are just and reasonable, and they're not encouraging entry. And I think it's in part because of the subsidies
Mm-hmm.
that are no longer subject to MOPR. So the subsidies are depressing prices and bids. But then you also have the RTOs themselves. I think some of them lack a commitment to market integrity.
Mm-hmm.
And they've become, their God is consensus and the stakeholder process.
Yeah.
So some of them do whatever the stakeholders want them to do, even if they know it actually will retard reliability.
Mm-hmm.
Their commitment to consensus makes me think of the Maggie Thatcher quote from years ago that I actually have right here. That she said that consensus is the process of abandoning all beliefs, principles, values, and policies in search of something in which no one believes, but to which no one objects. The process of avoiding the very issues that have to be solved merely because you cannot get agreement on the way ahead.
Hmm.
And I think that describes the RTO stakeholder process in some RTOs well. So to me, that if you think that's true, there's two basic options. One is to unwind the forward capacity markets and rely on long-term contracts and a day-ahead real-time market, but rely on long-term contracts so that every utility in a 15-state RTO would have much better ability to get whatever mix of electric supply has been imposed on them by law, and then they would compare to the status quo, right? Because the competitive markets, when I knew them, what was the goal? It was to assure adequate, reliable supplies of electricity at a reasonable cost. Period. Mm-hmm. There was no electric supply mix that was part of that fact, and there was a consensus between the federal government and really all states that was the correct goal. Yep. But now many states have said no. What's more important than adequate, reliable supplies at reasonable cost is that the electricity supply mix have this characteristic or this shape, and that's much more important than price. I think in some cases the states don't want to acknowledge that will be a higher price environment.
I was about to say, they say that, and then when the price comes due, they go, "Oh, that's not what I meant." And it's like, well, that is the outcome that you're asking for.
Yeah. And there's tension now. It's not. I really don't think it's properly seen as federal-state tension. It's state tension, right? Because in a multi-state RTO, if states have varying and different, in some cases, no electricity supply mix mandates, it's really hard for a single market with a single grid to deliver all of that without contributing a possible penny to your neighbor. Whereas I think it would be easier. It would be easier if you had a day-ahead real-time market, long-term contracts. You still have the challenges about transmission expansion and cost allocation. But I think in part it's the loss of consensus on what's the goal of competitive markets. It used to be clear: adequate, reliable supply of electricity, reasonable cost, period. And I think that's still how that FERC still sees that as the goal, I believe. But I don't think many states would agree with that. Some states would, but I don't think many.
Yeah, it probably won't surprise you that we still think capacity markets make a lot of sense, although we would agree that there needs to be some adjustments made because the world has changed around them. Not, the classic Bill Hogan model is not the world we live in today for the reasons that you noted. I find it interesting that you mentioned the state versus state, because of course we raised that issue in the MOPR case, this horizontal federalism question about it's not just cooperative federalism, emphasis on cooperative, but it's as you note, it's the state policy choices, which the states have the right to do what they want to do, but they're creating all kinds of mischief between themselves as state A says, I want to do X, and state B says, well, you can do whatever you want, but you're not going to get us to pay for it. And then the argument ensues.
Right. And the other model, so I think in the forward capacity markets, you either take a step back and you rely more on contracts to assure resource adequacy, or you do the opposite of what some are calling for. Some are calling for FERC to delegate authority to states and for states to basically have control over RTOs. One, I don't think that's possible. I mean, there's a U.S. telecom case from, I think, 2007 that basically lays down the black letter on delegation that federal agencies can delegate authorities to each other without express authorization, but they can only delegate to non-federal persons if there's express authorization. There isn't anything in the Federal Power Act. So first of all, I think that's a bad idea,
right?
Because if states don't agree, then you're delegating to the United Nations. I mean,
right.
you would,
I can tell you how that works out.
But FERC can't delegate. I think it's a bad idea, and it's illegal. So great, let's set that aside. But if FERC wanted to delegate to RTOs, if for some reason it was a good idea to delegate to RTOs, is there a way where you could have confidence that the RTOs are acting consistent with FERC policy? Well, you could have FERC appointed the RTO management and boards. And that's the only way FERC could delegate any authority, is if there's some indicia of federal control, either management or the boards. I mean, it could be the boards, and then they elect them, they hire a CEO. But to me, that's the only way there actually could be delegation, is if there's some level of federal control. And I'm not sure how many people would love that idea.
Yeah, there are some who would say that states are already exerting more control over the RTOs than perhaps they should to begin with, but that's maybe a discussion for another time. I don't want to drag you down the how to fix the Byzantine stakeholder process of the RTOs, because that we would spend way too much time there and still probably not come up with a good answer in the end. So with that, I'd love to ask you about reliability. It's obviously always a major focus at FERC. It is even more so now, given some of the weather events that we've seen over the last handful of years. I'm curious what you make of the challenges we're seeing today when it comes to reliability. And I guess from your seat, do you think policymakers and regulators are prioritizing it appropriately? Or are there things that you say, if I had to offer a suggestion, I'd suggest people look at one or two other things? Or are they doing a good job and you think, they've just got to do what they have to do, and we've got to get through this and ensure that we come out the other end in a more reliable system?
I haven't followed it closely enough to second guess my successors.
Sure.
And even if I did, I don't think I would.
Of course.
But I was glad at how we implemented reliability, because the concept that people envisioned was that FERC would be an appellate court, and that the industry basically would have the pen to draft standards because historically before EPAC, the NERC was a pretty weak organization. The regional councils were much more domineering over NERC. And then utilities in turn had a lot of influence in the regional councils. So the expectation was, well, the industry will basically draft the standards. NERC will send them to FERC with maybe minimal review, and then FERC will rubber stamp them. And I just thought that wasn't tenable after the California Western Power crisis, in part because if there was a future August 2003, because of very weak reliability standards, the notion that, hey, Congress, you didn't allow, it's not my fault, it's NERC's fault because you didn't let me modify standards and you didn't let me initiate standards would be pretty thin gruel.
That's a very unacceptable answer.
Yeah, so we looked at it. I mean, we had a great exchange in August 2005 on how could we implement it differently, internal exchange at FERC. And we decided the law there was enough discretion in it so that FERC could assert a much stronger role. And that it like one little thing that a lot of people maybe didn't notice was that ERO is not given a permanent license. I think it has a 5-year license, and every 5 years has to come back to FERC and basically show we've done a good job. And part of that is we've been following your advice, and not and the idea, even if FERC couldn't reject standards, it can order modifications. So I think the initial batch of standards was something like 124 standards were submitted, and 20, maybe that number's off, but 24 we put in the cooler. If you're a fan of the Great Escape movie, remember Steve McQueen when he tried to escape and he's arrested, he's put in the cooler. So 24 we thought these standards really had no value at all. So we just put them in the cooler, and they might still be there. People might have lost the key. But then of the remaining 80, my numbers will be off, but of the remaining 85, I think we ordered modifications to like 58 of the 85.
Okay.
And that was a way to say, well, we're clearly not a rubber stamp. And then when the standards were submitted, we performed a critical review of the standards. And there had been a view that, well, FERC staff don't have the competence to actually understand or review these standards. Well, I think FERC staff demonstrated they did have that ability. And then we required a lot of modifications, issuing directives, because the Act had a provision saying FERC could issue directives. And so we issued directives to require, that's been the tool to require new standards, but also modify proposed standards. So it's sort of like a delayed modification where you're saying, we accept this, and then we order you to make these 2 changes.
So as you look at reliability, I guess a little less on a technical level, but more on an operational level, gas electric coordination, I know was an issue back when you were at the commission. Phil Moeller talked about it to a great extent when he was on FERC. I talked about it when I was at the Ohio Commission. Phil and I worked together on some of these issues. And yet again, here we are 10 years or more after that, and we're still talking about gas electric coordination related issues and the challenges of two industries that every year seem to be stitched closer and closer together. So I'm curious about your thoughts about what FERC or industry should be doing to proactively address some of these issues, or how can industry be helpful in solving some of these conundrums as opposed to simply reading from our book and telling
Uh,
everyone that we do everything right and it's the other guy or the other girl that needs to
yeah,
change how they do things.
I I'm not sure. I mean, I'm not sure if FERC has the perfect legal tools to order a
Mm-hmm.
fix. I remember there was a technical conference where we spent most of the day on uh, the electric and gas days. Could
Yes.
you coordinate, sync up the electric and gas
Right.
days? And yeah, like you said, the two sectors said the way we do it is works just fine for us. Um, Now, could FERC do more? It depends on who you expect to be moving.
Yeah.
If you want the power day to match up with the gas day, that would probably be pretty easy to accomplish. But if you want the reverse, I
Not
mean,
so
could you
easy.
not? It seems like you couldn't directly mandate it, but could you do it through NASB rules? So soft pressure through
Yeah.
there'd be a way to nudge it. I guess if there was an outage that you could credibly say was due to the gas and the power day being misaligned,
Right.
would that, and then you could say this wouldn't have happened if the
Right.
gas day aligned with the power day. Does that result in some greater alignment or perfect alignment? I'm not,
I don't know
yeah,
if
I
you
can't.
share it, but I'm of the mind that there is no silver bullet here, that there are a number of smaller incremental things that I think taken in the aggregate could make a pretty profound impact on things. And certainly we've been working with our industry partners to try to get there from here. And I think people are generally a little, concerned is the wrong word. I think people are not anxious for FERC or others to weigh in. And NERC has talked a little bit about a GRO and what that would look like. And I think if we can make some incremental progress along the way, that
Mhm.
additive benefit will help resolve some of these issues. So I hope I'm right. And I guess we'll have to see how that plays out as time goes forward. So one of the other issues that comes right on the heels of gas electric issues, of course, is permitting and siting. And I know that you're a watcher. Those of us that are around Washington can't help but hear the discussion that's been going on in perpetuity. But do you think that's one of the keys to unlocking how we're going to be able to solve some of the reliability challenges, some of the market related challenges, and some of the deployment challenges for all types of resources? It's not limited, I don't think, to one preferred resource or another, but can that help us address many of the growing issues around electricity load growth for the first time, probably since you were chairman? And now we're seeing it in spades, and we've got retirements. So there's just a lot of things happening all at once. And you've lived through complicated times. What would you say in response to that? Or what are some of the ways to think about addressing it?
And you're talking about electric transmission, not pipelines,
Well,
right?
it's both, actually. I
Okay.
think from my seat, it's both because the political deal seems pretty straightforward, right? The renewable crowd needs the wires and they need permitting reform to ensure that they can get it from where it's generated to where it needs to be. And virtually every credible analysis says you're going to need more gas resources, not less, even though they may not run in the same performance profile that they do today. And that's going to require additional pipeline infrastructure. So it feels to me like it's both sides of the equation. But if you have one that you'd rather answer, of course, I'm
Um,
happy.
well, I'll try to address both quickly.
Great.
On pipelines, one thing that's stunning to me is how slow FERC is on the pipeline process.
Hmm.
When I was there, pre-filing would routinely take 6 to 8 months, and now I think it takes a year and a half or longer.
Wow.
And then the certificate process itself, right? There's two processes. The certificate process, I remember Rex West was more than a 700-mile pipeline
Hmm.
crossing 5 states.
Yeah.
And Rex West took 11 months, the certificate process, 11 months. Now I think it's multiple years.
Wow.
And it seems like the schedule, FERC doesn't seem to have taken any steps to try to reduce those delays
Hmm.
or even understand what's driving them. I mean, it could be there's a lot of internal deliberations, but from the outside, it just seems both pre-filing and the certificate process keep taking longer and longer and longer.
Yeah.
Now, I will say that the opposition of pipelines is much more fierce and much, much smarter than when I was there.
Yeah.
The typical opposition would be a NEPA kind of opposition saying, oh, you only studied 8 alternatives, not 20,
Right.
Or you didn't study my cherished alternative. And those are loser arguments consistently. Yep. And now the opponents are much smarter. On electric transmission, we're still dealing with a legacy that when the Power Act was written in 1935, electric transmission was local. It was local. It was not an interstate business.
That's right.
Pipelines were always interstate, but even then, the original Gas Act, the 38 Act, did not provide for federal siting of pipelines. It provided for state siting. But as pipelines were being built from Texas to New York, a lot of states required that their state benefit, that the primary benefits have to be to that state. Well, 8 states can't each be the primary beneficiary of a pipeline.
Yeah.
Right. So Congress in 47, they changed the law, completely preempted states and put in state siting. Congress in 2005 came up with a solution that, well, the status quo is not working. But instead of preempting states, they added this federal process. Mm-hmm. And then they bifurcated the role between DOE, an agency that has limited regulatory competence. It is not an infrastructure agency. Right. I mean, Department of Energy's contribution to infrastructure is the uncompleted superconducting supercollider, the incomplete Clinch River breeder reactor. There's a number of incomplete big projects that's sort of their infrastructure legacy. And I've always thought, well, okay, if we're dealing with the law as it is, the DOE role can be consolidated with FERC's. Yeah. You know, like I said earlier, agencies can delegate authority to each other. Yep. And there have been a couple times where DOE has seemed to have been comfortable to delegate its role to FERC. There you could have, instead of having 2 sequential proceedings at 2 different agencies, one of which has been citing infrastructure since 1920, one of which has never done so, you do it in one agency. Yeah. And so that limited federal role, to the extent it's used, would at least work better. Yep. And, you know, if there's another August 2003, and it's seen to have been caused by inadequate transmission, does that put sort of the pipeline model back on the table? I don't know.
Yeah. Well, we hope to avoid those kind of situations, to be sure, and maybe we can have policymakers that are thoughtful enough in Congress to pass something that would help solve the problem, although I share your concern that it's more of a sentence than an opportunity to serve these days, but we'll set aside our political thoughts. So we're coming up against the end of our time, Joe. I just have one last question for you. As you look at artificial intelligence and reshoring and data centers and demand growth, you know, how are you looking over the horizon about what that means for the energy system generally, maybe for consumers as well, coming back to our original discussion around the award that you received, both from the consumer organization, but also from markets? How do you see all that playing out? Because you can't go a day without reading in at least one of the newspapers of record that this is a burgeoning issue. It's potentially problematic. It's a gold mine. It's all kinds of things. How are you thinking about some of this?
Well, I haven't thought about it a lot, but I think it does mean that demand is likely to be much higher than people are projecting, and therefore wholesale power prices might be much higher than people are projecting. Hopefully there's enough power to go around, but it'll be more costly.
Yeah, I think that's the shorthand version of what I hope will be a much longer story as we get into this over the next several years. So with that, Joe, I want to thank you for taking time to visit with us. We certainly appreciate it. Want to congratulate you again on being our first ever award winner. We were sorry that you couldn't make it, but certainly appreciate the work that you've done and know that you continue to be a supporter of well-functioning markets as we do. And we will continue to advocate to ensure that we get those both now and in the future.
Great. Thanks, Todd. Thanks for inviting me. I enjoyed it.
Thanks for listening to Energy Solutions. As always, subscribe to this podcast for more in-depth interviews with leading voices in energy today. If you like this episode, please share it on social media with your coworkers, friends, and family. You can also connect with us on X, at EPSA News, on LinkedIn, and on Threads at Electric Power Supply. And subscribe, follow, leave a rating or comment on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Pandora, and now YouTube, which we've just joined. We'd love to hear from you.
Energy Solutions is brought to you by the Electric Power Supply Association. EPSA represents America's competitive power suppliers, which bring about 150,000 megawatts of power generation resources to customers throughout the United States. Discover the power of competition at www.epsa.org.